Hello, everyone. Welcome all the friends coming to DigitalFUTURES. So today is a very special day. So right now it's morning or good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants. This is a Chinese New Year. So it's a great honor for us to invite a very special guest coming to this platform tonight. So the topic today is AI and creativity. So DigitalFUTURES actually was set up by New and me and go back to 11 years ago. At that time, Tongji University in Shanghai have a collaboration with USC in Los Angeles. So it's a great honor, thanks to all the people support us at very early time. And from last year, very special time, we goes to online. So right now, every week, every Saturday, we organize a special online presentation and keynotes and the young DigitalFUTURES Young panel discussions. So it's a really good sharing platform for all the new knowledge and the new participants. So this year is really special because of the quarantine policy. Most of the Chinese audience right now stay at home. So it's a great honor. New help us to invite the expertise, especially from Los Angeles. So that's the really special moment. I introduce all the guests today to the Chinese audience as the new Los Angeles school. So I think you are the representatives who can have the new knowledge and give us some really fantastic the new avant-garde experimental test in the new discipline of architecture. So it's a great moment. I would like to switch to Neil. Would you please to introduce the special guest tonight and today to all the audience?
Thank you, Philip. Thank you. And thank you also to all the team that's supporting us, both in China and in the West. This platform relies upon the generosity of volunteers who give their time for free. And that's really part of our mission, to try and bring educational ideas for free to people across the globe. We don't think that education should be the privilege of the elite, but should be available for everyone. And since last summer, when with DigitalFUTURES World, we, as it were, broke through the walls of the classroom and began to open up this kind of platform to people from all over the world, no matter where they are, no matter whether or not they can afford to come and study at the most expensive schools in the world. We have tried to establish or further establish this platform as a form of, as a place where educational ideas are available for free. Today we've got a very special event. I want to start off by wishing you all a happy Chinese New Year. This platform grew out of China, and it depends largely on a very committed group of people who are following us in China. Today, then, we are going to have some virtual fireworks, some fireworks on the screen, as it were, bringing you the very best of the latest ideas that are coming out of both architecture and art. And they just happen to be, we happen to be all in Los Angeles at the moment, where it's very early in the morning, I might say, and I want to thank our guests for coming so early. But we want to really address two things today. One is the idea that AI is addressing, it can be creative in itself. I'll just say a few words about that, but more in particular, we want to look at the new forms of creative expression that are opening up all over the world. Let me simply say that that across the world, it seems to me, architects and artists are getting fascinated by artificial intelligence. I can speak for myself, perhaps, in saying that when I've been teaching at FIU, Florida International University, my students we've just finished a workshop with Daniel Bolojan, and I'm showing you one of the results of that workshop. My students are completely fascinated. I teach a theory course there, and 95% of the students are writing about AI. It's clearly the hot topic. But let me say a few words about what maybe we're not going to talk about so much today. The other thing I wanted to mention is the fact that Philip and I have an ambition to try and set up some kind of global classroom. That's the ambition. And alongside this weekend is a very special weekend because we've got a session on neuroscience, AI and neuroscience, where we're bringing in Refik again, then Anil Seth, who is one of the rock stars in the world of neuroscience. He has a TED Talk with 11 million hits. Memo Acton, there'll also be people like Patrick Schumacher, Sanford Quinter, Benjamin Bratton, Matthias Del Campo, Ben Asfarahi and others there for that event tomorrow. If you'd like to do a screen capture of this, you can get some sense of what's going on. We also had a theory session last week on AI and creativity on the 7th of February, where I've put the links in there, and maybe we can share them also on the live stream. So alongside this, then, there is another event tomorrow where we can look at how the hallucinations of AI, the machine hallucinations of AI, can be compared to the hallucinations of the mind itself. And this is going to be a very, very special event also. So I want to address the question that maybe it was not going to be central today, but whether AI can be creative, just to go and look back over history and at some of the comments that have been made. Ada Lovelace, seen here on Doctor Who. Ada Lovelace is reputed to have been the first programmer of a computer, or at least a proto-programmer of a proto-computer, because the machine that she was developing with Charles Babbage was never actually finally completed. But Ada Lovelace could see the possibility of what a computer could be, and could see the possibility of programming. And Ada Lovelace herself was the daughter of Lord Byron, a very famous poet in the UK. But she didn't believe that the computer itself could be creative. They could simply do whatever it's been programmed to do. It couldn't originate anything. And that, to a large extent, has been the view that's been held by many people since then, including even Makoto Watanabe, who was part of our conference at Digital Futures about 3 years ago, where he makes the comment that basically that people are the only ones who can create an image that does not yet exist. Machines do not have dreams. That comment was made, I think, in 2016. And I wonder whether he would revise that comment now, because now we're in a situation where we can see how AI can create images of, in this case, people who do not exist. This is an example of style GANs that has been developed in recent years, in the last 5-6 years, which shows how you can hallucinate new faces of non-existing people. And AI has leapt forward since the development of GANs. Equally, in architecture, this is the work of Wan Yu He of XCool, who will be joining us for the discussion. We could also dream up buildings that do not yet exist. In fact, there was a site, This Person Does Not Exist, where you could generate these faces. There was also a site, This Building Does Not Exist, where you could hallucinate these new buildings. So all of a sudden, we're discovering that actually AI, it can be creative and can produce things that do not exist. Makoto Watanabe's comment was perhaps a little bit, is no longer the case. But even more so, we've discovered in certain fields, such as chess and Go, that deep learning in particular has been able to do things that are quite extraordinary. One of the famous moments in the history of AI was a particular move that was made in game 2, move 37, of a match between Lee Sedol, the leading Korean Go player, and AlphaGo. And in this move, the computer came up with something that with a move that no one had made before. At first, they thought it was a mistake, and there were a series of these slack moves which seemed to not make sense initially. But then the strategic brilliance of these moves became obvious. It became clear that AI was superior to human beings. And what struck me was that this comment made by Lee Sedol, that not only was AI potentially creative, but it showed us that moves that we thought were creative were actually quite conventional. This matching between Lee Sedol and AlphaGo was also very famous in China, because it was what started the great AI rush in China. And since then, the interest in AI has been truly extraordinary. And let us never underestimate the capabilities of AI. Whereas Jack Ma believes that human beings couldn't create anything else that is smarter than human beings, Elon Musk is of the opposite opinion, and we might not even be able to recognize the strategic brilliance of what AI can do, because it might be ahead of what we can even contemplate ourselves. So the possibilities of AI are really, truly extraordinary. But it seems to me the issue is not so much whether AI can be creative or not. Clearly, it can generate novel outcomes and do extraordinary things, whether or not we call that creative. But the key question is how we can harness these creative technologies and in order to generate new forms of artistic and architectural expression. So we're now entering what Philip and I have called a cyborg culture, whereby AI becomes a prosthesis to the human imagination, and it's opening up many other ways of thinking beyond the capabilities of what we were able to do before. And in fact, as Watanabe himself had, he foresaw the possibility that eventually machines would be able to dream, and then this would lead to an extraordinary collaboration between brains and machines. The idea that the human mind could be enhanced, extended, AI could become a form of extended intelligence. And Elon Musk again comments that now we are all cyborgs. We have a machine extension of ourselves in the forms of our phones, our computers, and our applications. We are all superhuman. And I think that's an extraordinary kind of comment to which to kind of open up in our discussion about today of new modes of creativity that are afforded by AI. Because what it seems to me is that we are entering into a new era when the first genuinely new way of operating, as Matthias Del Campo has observed, has begun to kind of hit the scene. And it's hit the scene in an incredible way, literally in the last few years. I'm delighted today to be able to welcome some really astonishingly capable practitioners from all of them whom have to be based in LA at the moment, which happens to be a coincidence, but LA has always been a progressive city. I have a list of biographies of all the participants, but in many ways, that is not so relevant as what they're doing now. Where they come from is not so relevant as where they are now. But let me start with Refik. I think Refik, who came from Turkey in 2012, he came to LA. The first thing he did was to drive to Frank Gehry's Walt Disney Concert Hall. But he was disappointed to find this building with the lights off and completely asleep. One of the most important moments came in October of 2018 when Refik, with the support of Google AMI, opened up a series of spotlights of projectors onto that building and brought it alive, and with an extraordinary moment, allowing the building to dream and, as it were, to have consciousness. Since then, Refik has gone on to become perhaps the leading media artist in the world. He's certainly captured the imagination of architects and architectural students around the world. He's not an architect, but buildings are his material and also his canvas. Next, we come to Casey Ream, who again, I could talk about how his collaborations in the past with Roland Snooks and his previous existence in Carnegie Mellon and elsewhere, teaching in other schools. But importantly, is what he's been doing since he came to LA and to SciArc, I think, which is most significant. And he was responsible for designing the computation behind an extraordinary event, the Architectural Beast, the first ever real exhibition about the potential of AI in architecture, that took place about 2019, I think it was. And since then, he's gone on to develop an extraordinary culture in SciArc of using AI and deep learning in particular to generate designs. Damjan Jovanovic is his colleague there. Damjan comes originally from Serbia. And of course, we've seen from Eastern Europe an extraordinary outpouring of talent. Next week, I think it is, we have a session on Russian architects working on AI. Daniel Bolojan comes from Romania. And alongside the kind of intellectual tradition of Slavoj Žižek and others coming out of the former Yugoslavia, we can see some highly talented young artists and architects using AI. Damjan, together with his partner Lidija, are the principles of life forms, where they have produced some extraordinary new work. What says more about them than anything else, though, is the work itself. So I'm not going to say any more about their backgrounds and so on, but simply to thank them for being here. I'm delighted to have such an array of talent today to give what I hope will be a real fireworks display to celebrate Chinese New Year. So let me stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Refik. Refik, it's always great to see you, and I just want to thank you for the inspiration. My students are completely enthralled with your work. You've really revolutionized architectural culture, and thank you so much for being here at this early hour of the morning. Over to you, Refik.
Thank you so much. Again, good morning, everyone. Happy Chinese New Year, happy Lunar Year. And I'm waking up and I promise I'll be short, quick. And if I'm a little bit fast, sorry for my coffee time. But I'm really great to be here with wonderful people and many pioneers who are thinking beyond, I think, what we can do with our physical quality of life. So I'm extremely inspired for many people that Neil and this platform brought before. And I watched them and I inspired them. So I'm so grateful to become one of them today with you. So I would like to humbly share a keynote over Zoom. There may be some choppy frames, but I'll do my best to explain what you are seeing to enhance the codec problems. The imagination can help us to see beyond the frames. So let me share my screen, and I think I'll fit in my 15 minutes as quick as possible. Hope you can see my screen. Okay, for friends all around the world, you are very welcome to see my work with a much high quality video experience on this website, or you are very welcome to follow for updates and things around the world. Thank you, Neil, again for introduction and being here today with you all. I'm a media artist and I do use data and recently, last 5 years actually, machine intelligence also as a collaborator. I'm currently teaching and researching at UCLA Design Media Arts Department, where I got my second MFA degree in Design Media Arts. And I'm very thankful to my colleagues and mentors such as Case Arias, Christian Moller, Jennifer Steinkamp, and many others at DMA. And I was, maybe my start for the creativity in my life start very cliche. And I really was 8 years old when I watched this movie Blade Runner, which I guess the reason I'm in love with science fiction, in love with cinema as a tool of imagination. But I was not just only super inspired by the movie itself, but I was also inspired by the potentials of near future, especially 2019 November Los Angeles, where I am connecting with you right now. But I was not just only inspired by the future of science fiction or remembering future. I was much more in my practice over the years inspired by the technology and its ramification on humanity, and actually how it's changing our culture, our DNA, our gene, how we are remembering and how we are learning and how we are eventually dreaming, and especially the controlling of the tools we use, the world we are in. And I think eventually privacy and free will become also interest for me in my practice. But I think the more and the more I just understand about how technology, the systems, hardware is changing who we are, I also much more inspired by how actually creating this new symbiotic relationship between the physical and the virtual world. The first thing in the morning we see a smartphone, the last thing at night we see sometimes a smartphone, and sometimes our life passed through between two checkpoints. Also, the feeling of sense of displacement, the feeling of not even being sure in the physical or virtual world is becoming more and more inspiring. And I think for me at least, beyond just a problem, I am constantly asking question, what else can we do with this unique situation for humanity? And I know that John Maeda, I mean, as a hero, as an inspiring mind, he says design is a solution to a problem. Art is a question to a problem. And I found myself not only a media artist, but also a designer and maybe a director, and really finding these nuances. But one of the, of course, challenging question I guess not only I am asking, but many of us probably asking is, what does it really mean to be a human in 21st century? And to answer this question, I found that I cannot answer this heavy question myself. And secondly, I was dreaming a practice that is not only for egocentric art experiences, a practice that is generating an experiences for anyone, any age, and any culture in the world. And this inclusive imagination cannot be done with myself. And for this, I am thankful to my team. Right now, we are 14 people, can speak 14 language, and represent 10 different countries in our studio. And for this, allow me, in over like 6 years, we were able to experiment and exhibit and have permanent pieces all over the world, including all these wonderful collaborators that are helping to shaping our imagination. This is not a cliche startup page. We only do artworks. We are only collaborating with wonderful people to unleash problems of our experiences. And finally, our artworks all around the world, except Antarctica, that I think is a good path to find that language of art that can be perceived everyone in the world. And over the years, like just 1 year is really heavy for us because of the pandemic and so on. But what really transformed me is almost 10 years ago, I started using a software called VVVV, 4V. And this software allowed me to start thinking with custom software development and allow me to go beyond commercial software limitations. And back in then, I was really inspired by the idea or a question, can data become a pigment? And over the years, I first visualized wind data. I tried to visualize even the invisible signals of Wi-Fi, LTE, 5G. And over the years, I was able to visualize invisible patterns of social media. I was able to create experiences on the form of architectural interventions. And I was always inspired by architecture. I truly inspired by the potential of architecture. And over the years, I also inspired that once light becomes a material, once light and architecture comes together, and once data becomes a pigment or data dramatization becomes a narrative on the architecture, I found that there's a whole new serendipity opened up. For example, I was inspired by what happens when the cliche material world of glass, concrete, and steel goes away, and what will happen if the light becomes that prominent experience for the architecture. And I found fascinating experiments in the public space, especially public space, to enhance the facades of the building or put AI data sculptures or data sculptures in the buildings in different forms. The change it happened in my practice was 2016, almost 5 years ago, around this day in San Francisco. Group of Google engineers from Google's Artist and Mission Intelligence Group, including Karen McDowell, Mike Tyka, and Blaise Agore Arcas, came together in San Francisco, in Gray Area, and they made an event called Deep Dream. In this event, while they were celebrating the inception, which is a deep dream, another like I think algorithmic experiment that changed many people like me, mind of imagining a machine can perhaps hallucinate in a limited sense. That was a massive day for me and my team. And I was honored to become one of the first artists in residence at AMI. And I was allowed to learn, use machine learning algorithms in my practice. Since me and my team was already working with data in extensively almost 6 years before the residency, I just thought, what will happen if a machine learning becomes my practice as well? I am not a scientist. I am not an architect. I don't want to just sound I'm an engineer, but I love learning Python. I love learning potentials of generative algorithms, and I love the idea of painting with a thinking brush. So over the years, as you see maybe in this timeline, of course, 2017 was the first result of using machine learning algorithms in a context of a library, which was a wonderful collaboration with SALT Archives in Istanbul, 1.7 million documents of publicly available cultural documents were the first data archives for our speculation. In archive dreaming, as far as we know, was the first experiment in public space, in built environments, using AI algorithms to speculate three-dimensional immersive experiment. And later on, many experiments went through, such as in Stanford, the curious case of Shuttle Höyük with Ian Hodder, one of the most fantastic professor researching archaeology and AI for 25 years. And over the years, we learned that once we apply machine learning algorithms, even a building can become a much more purposeful and eventually impactful experiment. So last 4 years for me and my team allow us to go beyond what can be done on a humbly open source architecture of software, but go deeper. For this, we were very fortunate to get a significant support from NVIDIA, Microsoft, and Intel as well. What does this mean is it allowed my team to go deeper in GPU computation. And thanks to Jensen Huang, who is the NVIDIA CEO, who also a collector, but also the supporter of our studios journey, or Bill Gates also was back in 2013, allow me and my team to deep dive in these algorithms, in these big data sets. over the years, 5 years, I can easily say that we look for many different patterns of information. And I'm extremely inspired by one topic. How can we detach ego from data? And how can we find collective memories for humanity to narrate collective dreams of humanity? So I'm not here as just an egocentric journey of an artist exploring his or her self inner world, but I'm trying to find that common language like mathematics that can allow us to do that. And if you see here a lot, I am extremely obsessed with one feeling that when machine learns this information, it stores in a space called latent space, which was a struck for me 2016 when I learned about this concept like 5 years ago. How can we even understand a space that we cannot even draw a plan or section? How on earth this n-dimensional mathematical folded space can be the future of humanity? Which, of course, I don't think it is that dangerous for me, but also one of the most fundamental transformation for my mind was generative adversarial networks. And I was very lucky 2016 when I started my journey using GAN algorithms. The journey didn't stop there. And over the 5 years, more than 100 individual models trained in our studio. Especially my obsession with architecture, I start with my obsession and train neural networks on Zaha Hadid, Frank Gehry, Tadao Ando, and Toyo Ito, and many, many others. And over the years, I was obsessed with also space research, such as ISS, Hubble, and MRO, and many others to understand the context of space as a mean of tool. During pandemic, we were very fortunate to record more than 200 million images of nature to let the machine hallucinate places that we cannot go, unfortunately, because of pandemic. And over the years, this imagination with machine learning algorithms also allowed me to understand what may be the inspiration for me, why my heroes like Ando, Gehry, Hadid, or Ito was a true source of inspiration. Especially 2018 and 17 and 18, my first focus was their body of work. In my work, you may see a lot of StyleGAN, StyleGAN 2, StyleGAN 2 ADA, our customized version of StyleGAN, PGGAN, DCGAN, CycleGAN, Pix2Pix, and so on. So pretty much we are trying to understand constantly how can we use a brush that is thinking in this context. But I think our projects over the year also enhance itself. 2018, I challenged a place called Artec House, a gallery in New York, also in DC, wonderful collaborators, to see what will happen if we step in a physical world where we are not wearing an AR or VR, and we do not enhance by the physical apparatus, but being augmented by the physical space by merging the physical and virtual world. So you are seeing machine hallucination. 2018 and 19, the most focus of our studio became an installation in New York Chelsea market. More than 100,000 people were able to step inside 18-channel projection, 32-channel sound, and felt the feeling of a machine mind, and you are kind of visualizing or witnessing what will happen if a machine have access to 113 million images of New York. Over the year, New York, Berlin, Stockholm, Seoul, and many other cities became also our research of interest. And if, as you see here, I am extremely obsessed with fluid dynamics almost last 8 years. Especially in my work, I'm trying to find that poetry in the GAN algorithms or in latent space through fluid dynamics almost now last maybe 8 years. And one of our studio's prominent challenge, which my heroes, Frank Gehry, is building here in Los Angeles, Disney Hall building, which is the home of LA Philharmonic. And LA Philharmonic, one of the most prominent organizations in the world, challenging the performing arts, allowed me and my team to celebrate their 100 years. And what was fascinating for me was an institution was trying to engage for its next decade, next century, by speculating the future of architecture. My question was simple. Can a building learn? Can it dream? To make this happen, to truly generate a skin on the building, we were needed 13 channel projection, 13 unique location, and each location has 4 projectors, makes 42 channel projection, more than 4 IMAX resolution. All the compound curve of Gary's Disney Hall were becoming a canvas. And eventually, what was a challenge also, how can we take the legendary Katia model of the building from a rhino to like more contemporary tools like Houdini and transform the building into a living skin, speculate alternative materials, see through the facade, show beyond what we can perceive on the facade, and let AI to become a part of a collaborator, and make a narrative by using 100 years of data sets of LA Phil, and make every decision coming from almost AI algorithms. The project transformed our studio and allowed us to go beyond, I think, our imagination. And I'm deeply thankful to Google AMI team, Google Arts and Culture, LA Philharmonic, and of course, Frank Gehry to support this vision. 2018, we almost welcomed 100,000 people on the streets of downtown Los Angeles. More than 5 days, anyone, any age from Los Angeles welcomed with their dogs and loved ones, witness truly a free public art that was also witnessed by many other mentors and genius people such as Alejandro Inharito, one of my another hero, and he was saying, finally, I was able to touch science fiction. And his comment was very important, but most important was Frank Gehry. And Frank Gehry was saying, now I understand a building can dream, but also one of my dream, which was projecting on the Disney Hall, was happening in 2018 and 19. So I was deeply honored to have his opinion about this. And finally, the things get more and more complicated, as you may guess. And last December, I was honored to get a commission from National Gallery of Victoria in Australia. And for this, I got another wonderful email from Google AI Quantum team, the team led by Hartmut Newman and many wonderful researchers here in Santa Barbara, who were able to generate quantum advantage experiment. In their Nature paper, they were trying to speculate a new ways of measuring the necessity of quantum computation and find a test, an experiment and research that allows quantum computation to compute a challenge that is pretty impossible to be done by a classical computer. I was extremely inspired by Alex Greenland's Ex Machina, but also recently Devs. I was extremely inspired by the theory by Hughes Everett, many worlds interpretation, heavily inspired by quantum computation and quantum physics. And me and my team were able to perceive this project by using Thalgan 2ADA transformation inspired by the quantum advantage dataset. And we were able to create a combination of Hilbert space, which is where the quantum computation mostly computes, and latent space, where AI can speculate its own entity. What we are watching is 200 million data set of nature transcoded into the latent space, inspired by the quantum noise, which we generated from scratch, and let AI speculate alternative dimensions in the form of narrative in a 10 meter by 10 meter media wall. And I'm very deeply grateful that this project turned into a reality, not a render. It was open in Melbourne, and hopefully to bring this anywhere in the world right after the pandemic, to share this as much as possible with the world. So I'm happy to be here today with you to share the work, the context, and discourse, and happy to share and get more questions after this wonderful panel together. And happy to say that we do not only work with this project, but we are constantly working with climate change and many other collective problems of humanity to use our skill set to do things that are functional and have a structure. Thank you very much, and happy to get your questions and be in this panel together with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Refik. That was amazing as always. Really tremendous. And I was just when you showed that the Walt Disney Concert Hall, and I was there with my students. I was there, and I thought that the gesture of making something free for the public was exactly what we're trying to do in Digital Futures. This is a wonderful gesture. Thank you so much, Refik. It was inspirational work as ever. And I'll just say that we will be uploading this this video onto the recording of this event onto our YouTube channel and Bilibili channels, so you can all enjoy this further again later. That was absolutely astonishing, Refik. Many thanks. So I'd like to call upon Casey Ream, who in parallel with Refik, in the same city, has, and maybe possibly in terms of the impact as well, just slightly behind, but having an enormous impact, I think, on architectural culture. I'd like to invite Casey to share some of his thoughts. Casey, as I mentioned, was responsible for a little over a year, less than a year after this amazing event by Refik, of bringing architecture into the gallery in Frac in France, an astonishing event in itself. So all of a sudden we're seeing this explosion of creativity. So welcome, Casey.
Thank you, Neil, for having me. I think I'm actually not going to be talking at all about that piece that you brought up a couple of times in Frac, just because it didn't really sit into. This is a kind of a short conversation, I think, today, and it didn't really. It's not a piece that necessarily sits comfortably within some of the larger conceptual projects we've been working on over the years. I want to kind of outline today some of the conceptual frameworks that we operate in within our office and our studio, and then also within the kind of curriculum that I teach at SciArc. But I want to kind of begin to frame it around a series of kind of topics or questions that we're constantly interrogating as part of this, rather than overtly get into a kind of discourse about what creativity is or what it means to be creative with the AI. I think it's more interesting in terms of the way we think to look at like what are the kind of utilities or biases within a system that can be leveraged towards producing innovative content. But ultimately, when we're talking about working with feed-forward networks, as Neil mentioned, this kind of feed-forward, the neural networks and the machine learning side of intelligent agency fits in with a kind of longer trajectory of looking at intelligent agency with an architecture of like coding systems which respond to external inputs and then put impacts or effects back out into the world that has been ongoing since 2003, including the kind of stretch Neil mentioned of working with Kukuja for a while back when I was living in New York still. But ultimately, when we're talking about designing with these kind of feed-forward intelligences, what we're talking about is designing through correlation. And we're just talking about designing through assembling information into value. So I put this quote up from Thomas Aquinas as part of his cosmological theory, because it's kind of a concept that goes back to this idea of world building, or this idea of in theology, where his kind of he had a treatise that somehow, because the world seemed to be so contingently interacted and related and operating, that there must be some kind of intelligence behind it. And that's the kind of the fiction that we operate in within operating with these types of networks, is that by assembling contingent pieces of information, we somehow arrive at a kind of creative entity. There's kind of two main kind of territories that I want to discuss that we are continuously thinking about when working with these kind of machines of correlation. First is the kind of conceptual issues surrounding automation, which is obviously at the heart a lot of the research that goes into kind of feed-forward intelligences. And then questions that come up around it, like with the kind of infinite production, with different constrained forms of learning within the machine, how we design how the machines learn. Is heterogeny really something that can be produced? And kind of coinciding with that is this question of inductive stagnation, which is a term that I think Patricia Reed utilizes a lot when describing not just these types of systems, but also some of the social media systems and the phenomena we observe of when you're working with a kind of feed-forward intelligence like these, there's a tendency for the machine to be constrained to the truths that have pre-existed. And I think some of the GANs that Neil showed in his introduction, I think, are really good examples of that. Like we can make any building image, we want that doesn't exist as long as it looks like all of the building images we've seen before. So there's a kind of a gap between maybe quantitative difference within specific characters, and maybe later in the conversation we can talk about how something like the Go game or the kind of chess apps might differ in terms of that resolution of the space that the machine is operating on as a designer and its impacts or visibility of creativity. And then finally, the kind of spatial and temporal consequences of endless scale, like what continuing the kind of project of frameless production from the kind of maybe starting with the futurists in the early 20th century about moving beyond the kind of framed art piece as an object, as something that is extensive. And I think a good example of that is that particular line is a series that we started now it's almost 6 years ago now, where we began looking at using neural networks to explore generating fictional cities. And the project was really an exercise for us that had come out of some limitations that had emerged in all of our more explicitly coded intelligent agent systems and architecture about looking at machines which could understand hierarchy and scale. So this is a fairly high resolution print for neural networks. It's a 40-inch by 40-inch by 300 dpi image that I scaled down here for well, obviously because it's on a screen now. This is we're in person, or this is like Zoom reality now. Everything is at 1024 no matter what. But the idea is I wanted to begin to explore machines which could take uninhabited landscapes. So in this case, I was taking like scenes from the Mojave Desert, and then see if I could begin to train neural networks to take on the kind of depth of stack of information around hierarchy and polyscalar effects within this design space. So really, it's about these were kind of a very like willing participant in that kind of inductive stagnation problem of leaning in to see like how close I could get to scaling up the kind of a stack of different image-based generative and classification algorithms to produce something which had a kind of seeming plausibility as an urban landscape and unurban, or an uninhabited input site. And I think as I'm going to get into a little bit more talking about perception is like a main territory that we're working in. And I never really showed the image on the left. And in fact, when we were producing the work, when we were producing this work in 2015, we never visualized them this way, but we were able to achieve this high resolution because it's not a single network producing a single image. And in fact, speaking of Google AMI, like my first introduction to Refik Anadol, who's one of the directors there, he was looking for someone for an exhibition, ended up not having to do some hallucinated landscapes, and Ben Bratton kind of introduced me to him because he had seen these. And when Kenrick saw how I had made them, I think he expressed a little bit of disappointment about how stupid and brute force it was. Like it was, there's just thousands of little tiles. There's 6 machines, and each of the machine is getting triggered on a different part of the landscape by a different result from a classifier. So when we're actually producing this image on the left, or producing the image on the right, like in the office, the image on the left was just a CSV file of numbers which told us which machine to trigger in the production. But it goes back and forth, I think, also, like even though I divided the talk into kind of 2 territories of like issues of automation and issues of perception, they're really kind of continuously intertwined. And designing both that perception and that kind of realm of infinite production go hand in hand. But the kind of agenda with these was that I could continuously feed new landscapes, and it would always kind of output a kind of endless spectrum of of urban master plans. That's like it's the kind of piece that won't die. It seems every year I get asked to kind of re-exhibit some version of it. So we did a version where I started taking sites from within it and generating 3D objects using some 3D GANs that were based off of the same kind of strategies. Like I think all of the machines that we work with in the office primarily, and it's why I didn't include the architectural beast in today's presentation, they're machines that have encoders at the front end, and they're machines that are dealing with taking information from somewhere and translating it into some other thing. So in this case, we were correlating different building footprints to their forms in a kind of voxel space. with a kind of similar brute force strategy. Like this looks like kind of one monolith, but it's really like several thousand little tiny squares that are encoding the squares or cubes of space that are encoding the space previous to them, and then speculating on that kind of new content of the geometry. I also realized I've never taken a photograph of this, so I took it just before I logged on. This thing's been sitting on my desk for 4 years, but I never actually took a photo. I've been showing a rendering since that time. And then this past spring, we exhibited last March, although we produced this over the winter, we exhibited both, or actually last January, we did the first exhibition of this in Texas, with kind of the next version, where we began to increase this exploration of automating these correlated layers of urban design, from translating in the upper left site, kind of using the neural networks to simulate the kind of impacts of global warming on Greenland, for example, how it could be translated into a city more based off of those types of climates that we're used to seeing, or what that climate would become after the global warming, extrapolating a kind of fake city plan. And we have a kind of running history of using Campo Marzio in all of our projects as the kind of the foundations of any of our kind of plan generation, generating more little 3D buildings, but also like we wanted to look at like taking that city plan, extending into kind of infinite stack, which we generated a series of exterior elevations from as a kind of video. And then within that, we also took slices of these exterior elevations and used other networks to kind of project what the floor plan might look like, and what the interior perspectives of that space might look like, and then training it on a kind of classification process to predict how much that apartment might cost, and then also training a network off of a stack of text from real estate websites about how it might be described on one of these web posts. So again, this was a project about, it's just like looking at how we're using the machine to try to create these correlations or these contingencies for these kind of automated stacks of kind of world production. This is just some, I'll skip through this because it's a bit long, like some of the, little bit of a lag on my machine, sorry. This kind of infinite facade, as the facades are passing through, their elevations are being sliced and reinterpreted as interiors, and we start to like pull out some of these interior spaces here in a second. You can see like, here's the bad Zillow verbiage. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Zillow or Compass or these types of real estate websites, but these are the types of things that they say. Actually, generally, we're pretty happy with the way that the machine was describing these spaces in our training of it. It does say occasionally there's like weird things where it'll say like your apartment in Lower Manhattan has space for 9 picnic tables in the backyard. But in general, it's pretty good. And actually, one thing too is usually when I'm talking longer about inductive stagnation is the pricing. The pricing classifier we trained off of that was actually really effective. And when we were working with kind of actual interior photographs of apartments, it was very accurate in terms of predicting the kind of real estate value of those spaces. So even though it was done as just a kind of the speculative layer of adding a kind of additional correlated reality to the process, we were actually kind of surprised at how well it performed as a predictive tool. So we kind of simultaneously exhibited both at the Pompidou Center, and then also, actually Refik was in that show as well, and then also at University of Texas. Within the school, I've been using the kind of work that I do in the robot house as well to explore these kind of issues of automation within the three-dimensional space. So we've been doing a series of seminars over the last few years of like training like 3D networks and then looking at how to like procedurally transform them into something that the robot can build. And here's an example from, it looks like 2018, where a group had been training a 3D network on Pokemon, and then kind of translating that Pokemon into these like wooden structures. And we've been slowly kind of progressing this work. This is from 2019, where the students were working on training on kind of architectural chunks or sectional chunk precedents, which led to kind of these more abstracted results. And one of the things I think that we're pursuing in this work is the kind of legibility of the initial kind of network as a tool for giving us kind of ordering principles for the hierarchy and the figure and the form versus the kind of procedural algorithms which are layered on top of that, which generate the kind of detailed tectonics or the systems. And I think when we're talking about this problem of inductive stagnation, I think both hoax urbanism and this project are kind of wrestling with that, where hoax urbanism is very directly leaning into this reality of kind of reproducing the known aesthetics of what we expect a city to be. Whereas this one, I think they starts to become more distant, and it raises the question of a lot of the things that we interpreted as kind of generative within these systems and avoiding that kind of inductive stagnation problem are in fact just because they're not as, like this is a much lower performing model from a mathematical standpoint. And it's kind of the inabilities or the frictions of the machine to kind of more closely approximate the Pokemon in this case, or building sectional models in this case, that I think lead to a lot of what may be apophenically perceived by the designer as a kind of form of creativity. This is a nice quote from Patricia Reed about this issue of inductive stagnation. I kind of recommend her essays about that. So I'm going to blitz through perception too, and then I'm going to get to a project that like Damjan and I worked on together, but just kind of running through some of the questions that we're talking about, or that we're kind of been preoccupied around using the machines as tools for perception is like one, reevaluating the modes of description, both in terms of like engagement or interaction between designer and design production, but also in terms of like what is the valued information that we need to record about architecture or represent architecture to the machine learning tools, so that because that the determination of what we describe architecture through has a major impact on like what the production of the machine will be. Again, because we're ultimately designing creativity here by assembling a kind of understanding of correlations. So for example, this is a project I worked on with Damjan Jovanovic for the SciArc Spring Show this past spring in 2020, where the machine learning component of this project was not in terms of the kind of three-dimensional form of the object, but rather in a kind of semantic or a sentiment analysis package, a natural language processing package, because we have a kind of series of project also one we did together for Glass Speed magazine, where we were exploring like looking at how we can use the neural network to begin to translate text inputs into three-dimensional form. So in this case, we wanted to create an interface where people could type different texts into the machine, and the machine would kind of translate those into behaviors or component selections, or actually just those two things: component selection from a kind of catalog of preset parts, and behaviors of how the components operate within that three-dimensional space. So in the comparison to the kind of hoax urbanism projects and the robot projects, the 3D GAN projects, this is like questioning this kind of brute force representation of architecture as this fine-grained set of pixels or voxels, right? Like, which is a kind of very discrete volume is or isn't kind of reading of architecture, where in this we're starting to look at, well, is maybe semantic description or textual description of architecture the more appropriate way to efficiently record the design space of a building. We at SciArc, we've been kind of leaning more and more into these kind of classification tools and these perceptual tools as devices for understanding architectural problems in different ways. This is a research project by a student of mine this past fall, where he was looking at aligning the way that people spoke about different cities on social media platforms. In this case, it's a collection of posts about Austin on Reddit, and he was trying to show correlations between different like political pundits and the types of language utilized in this space. Ooh, I'm running way over on time, so I'll blitz through this in the next couple minutes. But top row is basically showing, like, on the left was Tucker Carlson, on the right is Rupa Benjamin, so showing a kind of gradient.
Casey, take your time. Take your time.
Oh, okay. I'm like 3/4 of the way through. I'll double up the speed a little bit.
That's okay. Don't worry. Take your time.
Okay. So here we're looking at Austin as a city, but we're looking at it as the way people talk about that city, and through this filter, and trying to uncover like what biases might be latent within the kind of things that people say about that urban space, right? Like how much do the things that they read on Twitter or the things that they read on the news influence the way that they understand a problem. And we can see like a pretty, one of the things also, I mean, it was kind of an unsurprising exposure, but you can see that like political positions, which are kind of on the extremes of the left and the right. Also, the AI ordered the political pundits at the top row also by their dissimilarity of language, which actually just, we were kind of interested to see that it correlated very tightly to actually the progression from left to right of the political systems that they were representing, or political ideologies that they represented. So I'm going to run through a string of like old Campo Marzio projects and then explain why when I started working with Damjan and Lidija on the new Campo Marzio, I had to rethink it. We've been interested in the Campo Marzio by Piranesi as a drawing kind of from the get-go with the Hoax Urbanism project. And because the work, again, going back to this idea that the neural network is a machine which generates value through assembling information. And I have a reading of the Campo Marzio drawing, which will be contested. I don't know if Damjan and Lidija will talk about that today, but they have a very different reading, or at least they have a, I don't know, very different. It's a kind of, we're still in a bubble here. But I think in contrast to something like the Noli map, where the building is represented as a kind of discrete object, there is building or there's void. It's a kind of duality. When we look at the Campo Marzio drawing, the way that we've been reading it over the years in the office was trying to construct an urbanism or an architecture purely through this exuberant assembly of kind of threshold conditions in plan. So less critical maybe in certain parts of the image are the figures of the shapes, but more of the kind of sequences of scalar spaces and scalar planar elements or materials within that drawing, which you know, we've led to kind of some looking at using the neural network to reorder the drawing based on kind of similarity of these thresholds to help us begin to create kind of catalogs or classifications of like planar types to these kind of series of projects, which I think represent our attempts to think through the architectural plan through this paradigm of an assemblage of threshold spaces. This project in a lot of ways is, or this string of projects, and it's ongoing. We're actually kind of working right now to build an ADU project with the robots using the combination of the 3D networks I was showing earlier and these types of plans. But it's a project to produce this idea of the kind of other expert about using the machine to construct ordering systems for architecture that sit outside the kind of historical canon of design. So like maybe the kind of dumb simplification of that is to say we wanted to make floor plans that you couldn't make analytical diagrams of, that would kind of defy a theory reading of them based on historical things, but still had a constructed value on top of it because through the performance and through the ordering system that the machine understood about how these thresholds and spaces and materials should relate to each other. Through that bias of it only understanding the architecture as a relationship of thresholds to spaces, as I described from our kind of particular reading of the Campo Marzio project. And it started with this project. The actual image on the left was the last kind of project we did where we didn't include any feed-forward networks in the design of the project, but had already been working with different types of machine vision and other kind of classification systems or ordering systems for space and plan with the GoFei, the good old-fashioned AI, where you had to write the behaviors in. But the kind of reality is, as we're pursuing this project of even something like a simple installation like this, the kind of absurdity of coding in all possible architectural details into a project while still attempting to produce something which is not kind of continuously spitting out the same kind of architecture which we're familiar with, became a kind of insurmountable task. So like in this one, we kind of first introduced our first kind of plan generating network to organize these pavilions and working with kind of procedural algorithms to generate the three-dimensionality of the piers. So we took that further into this project, which was a house in Joshua Tree. It's actually outside Joshua Tree, and Joshua Tree is a small town in the desert outside of Los Angeles that I'm not sure you're familiar with. And this project has a couple really weird phases. This is a kind of phase where it was at the client had upped it from being a 1,200 square foot kind of getaway cabin to a 3,000 square foot space that needed to be re-subdivided periodically based on different Airbnb scenarios. And then eventually the project just died for numerous reasons. But I think this is a good example of the type of thing that we've been pursuing lately, about really leaning into this idea that when looking at the building and the view of the plan, it would be difficult to lay down a kind of ordering system or a partie on it. But once you kind of inhabit the space, the kind of performative qualities of the assemblage of these material and threshold elements in the space as organizing tools becomes like evident performatively. So we simultaneously create this thing which these sorts of spaces, this project also, which we did the kind of next year, we're looking for a pavilion competition, which actually Sumin Ham, another colleague of ours at SCI-Arc, won. Was a really fantastic installation using augmented reality and steam timber building to construct. But we were Yasushi Ishida, my partner, and I were kind of still obsessed with that house plan, and we're trying to figure out the tectonics and the details of how to push it forward. One of the things I really like about this project is they're kind of pretty conservative in some ways, in a lot of ways sectionally, but they infuriate theorists. I think I caught a little bit of Marika Trotter's discussion of them in last summer's DF events, where she just continually repeated how deeply ugly they were, and that she was hopeful that one day this would turn into something more productive. But we're kind of a little bit of an incremental office, and we tend to get gnawed the same problem. You know, like as you saw with the Hoax Urbanism project kind of running for now like 6 years almost. So we're actually moving this forward now into construction of a small house. Hopefully by the end of August, we'll have the prototype of that structure finished. Some models of showing the kind of details. So you know, these two projects are using the 3D network to kind of generate the massing again, like as in those robot cases that I showed you. So even though our goal is kind of planar, like these models are working with training in the 3D and then using procedural algorithms to explore different panelization layups and different patterning systems within the kind of tectonics of the house, or the pavilion in this case. So then Damjan and I had been talking on and off about the kind of Campo Marzio as a project, and we decided for artwork that we were collaborating together, and then Lidija very happily joined on to participate, about extrapolating this into this idea of these kind of assembled thresholds into the kind of game space, where we could begin to construct value on our interpretation of the assemblage of these thresholds through the kind of users which were inhabiting them that we would simulate. So it started off kind of rocky, where when I sent Damjan the first set of plans that were being generated by the neural network, and with the new Campo Marzio, the neural network is exclusively working in the 2 dimensions on planar information. And that was because we needed it to kind of infinitely produce new spaces, and those 3D networks that I was showing, like, they're very unstable. I think they actually output usable material maybe, you know, less than 10% of the time. But so when I sent Damjan the first set of plans, he said, this has nothing to do with the Campo Marzio, it has streets. And I said, well, yeah, Campo Marzio has streets. And one of the fascinating things about this drawing, and why I like it so much, and I think we all like it to project into it so much, is it in and of itself is this act of trying to assemble a fictional reality from kind of partial information. Very, very analogous to the way that the machines we use in the office are assembling partial information into making either an architectural plan or an urban design. As like Piranesi was trying to, you know, this is before there was proper archaeology as a discipline, trying to extrapolate what ancient Rome would be like through these kind of partial fragmentation of ruins. So it becomes this awesome site for projecting any architectural idea you might have. You can pretty much find it in the Campo Marzio. For example, Peter Trummer has a great collection of essays in a journal, in the Stuttgart journal called Zero Piranesi, including an article by Michael Young, who, for example, uses the Campo Marzio drawing as by projecting some of the kind of triple O-based ideas and describing this idea of an urbanism based on, I believe he calls it an entourage of objects kind of loosely piled around on the site relating to each other, right? So these two readings of the project, both my kind of microscopic assemblage of the thresholds and these kind of more object-driven ideas of the figures within the site all exist within the same drawing. And it's really about how you begin to frame the information that you're, again, constructing as value to the machine as it's learning to kind of to privilege one or these other forms of biases or agendas in relationship to this drawing. So the image on the right is actually where we came to a middle ground. So in the first set, I had been zooming much further in because of my preoccupation with the relationship between threshold and sequence of space. Whereas Damjan was much more interested in this idea of a kind of the assemblage of figures. So we kind of pulled back enough that we would get these kind of strong characteristic forms, but maybe also they would be partially occluded. And we'd only get these kind of figures out of the drawing as the thing evolved over time. So this is a sequence of 100 of these procedurally generated cities where we kind of crop it so you can see the underlying plan that the neural net generated for the game space. This is kind of pulling back a bit more. This is zooming in on a smaller region, where again, as we were kind of going back and forth about the three-dimensionalization of these threshold conditions and these quasi-urban conditions of the Campo Marzio, trying to push it back into this territory where the elements would have more individual object-like characteristic. And I think that we were very effective in our discussion about going back and forth and creating this almost gradient between thinking about this kind of game space city that we had designed as a gradient of threshold conditions versus these, you'll see like as this thing starts to evolve, we start to get more kind of figural objects, things that become more along this idea of the assemblage of piled or sampled materials that become a project, maybe also relating more to some of Peter Trummer's readings of the project. And then let me, oops. So here's just some captures from the game. And Lidija and Damjan also did like a very heavy amount of development and research into the users for the city. And this was always a question for us and why it was important to kind of have this dialogue about being able to fine tune the machine and understand how the machine understood plans. Was we wanted to be able to, like, as we were designing these eccentric users for the project, we wanted to be able to fine tune the kind of scale of the thresholds and proportional relationships of the thresholds to create these urban conditions that these unfortunate, beautiful chrome creatures, which I think like Lidija did the most of the work on, would have to navigate. And the kind of eccentricities of these characteristics, right, give us a new idea about what an urban space could be, and understanding these urban spaces only in reference to the users that are being simulated for their production, and how these kind of allowing the perceptual mechanism of the machine to kind of reorder the data of the urban plan through the lens of the simulated user and what we can achieve through the game space simulation. And so I think that's it for me. Sorry, that's a little rough. It's pretty early here. I'm not as chipper as Refik, I think.
Thanks, Casey. That was great. I really love that Campo Marzio project. Let's move straight on to Damjan and Lidija. That was a great entree into your work. So welcome, Damjan and Lidija.
Hi, everyone. And thanks, Neil, for the invitation. We are super happy to share this panel with amazing artists and architects like Refik and Casey. And I'm going to share our screen. So just a sec. So, okay, so can you see our screen? Is everything?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So my name is Damjan, and this is Lidija. We are basically based in Los Angeles, and we have a studio called lifeforms.io. You can actually, this is the name of the studio, and you can check our work on that website. And we are mostly kind of interested in our work to basically we are working with real-time simulations made with kind of game engines as a primary format, and this has been going on for a few years now. I think since maybe 2013 or 14, we are interested in the possibilities of this kind of format that we named the interactive simulation, right? So what we are making basically are interactive artifacts that are not really games, but more like toys, or sometimes even tools for creating other kind of realities. And toys are more universal than games, and you can do more things with toys. And some of our projects are kind of made for exploring ideas of virtual life. And some are made for exploring architectural design as a playful activity. So we are interested in play, and we're interested in this idea of play actually as a fundamental human experience, which is structured but also open-ended, and also, you know, how play inspires new ways of seeing and thinking about the world. So why simulations? And simulations are an interesting format, and they're different than, for example, animations, because they are unpredictable to some degree, right? They have a degree of randomness and unpredictability, and they are kind of happening in real time, right? One kind of interesting part about it is that they challenge how we read and understand stories and narrative. For us, I think the main interest would be to explore the relationship between storytelling, narration, and basically this idea of kind of randomness and noise, and you know, everything that comes from the machine world, and how you know, machine intelligence kind of start producing new coherences that you can read against the more standard ways that we understand basically visual culture, right? So there is a difficulty that this kind of brings back to design. And you know, the question becomes like how you can work with randomness and how you can read and understand randomness, right? So when looking at the simulation, there is always a degree of pareidolia that is happening, right? There is this always component that our mind is trying to piece together a story from what it sees, basically, right? So in this case, this is a simulation that we made a few years ago. We are looking at two agents in a toy world that are interacting and kind of building meaning together, right? They're kind of, there is an automated kind of production of meaning during this kind of play, right? But what is actually happening here is that the meaning is constructed in the mind of the observer. When we look at some of these agents, we are starting to assign meaning to these objects, right? They have an appearance of intentionality. They have an appearance of intelligence. And I think one of the interesting parts about that is that we rarely talk about the gap, I think, between actual intelligence and the appearance of intelligence, or the appearance of intentionality, right? And this is, to me, this is something related to the history of animation. If you look at the history of Walt Disney Studios, for example, they were developing the famous 12 rules of animation in order to kind of evoke the emotional response in their audience, and to kind of project this appearance of intelligence and humanness to the screen. And I think what is fascinating about the artificial agents is that they kind of work in the similar way, but producing different readings and different effects. And I think what we're kind of interested in some ways is to explore that space for design and for kind of artistic storytelling. Yeah. So in our kind of idea, simulations are kind of combining the versatility of tools with kind of open-ended exploration of toys, right? And in some of the projects, we are also developing literally design tools that kind of work in a different way than you would imagine, basically, right? Like this is something that we call a playable drawing, where you can basically construct in real time a house for 2 humans and 2 non-humans. And the agents in the space, they start kind of responding to your actions, and they kind of communicate with each other to negotiate these new spatial conditions that you as a designer are imposing onto their small world, which is kind of interesting because we rarely think about kind of the external influence that these kind of small worlds are getting from the designer. You know, there is in architectural design, there is a whole history of basically understanding you know, the kind of the specificity of, let's say, Cartesian space, like here, with as being designed from the God view, you know, detached observer that looks onto the small world and has total control over it, right? So this was one kind of idea to maybe think about the relation between the creator, let's say, and the agents themselves, and what new ways we can imagine for that. I mean, we are massively inspired by computer games and basically using computer games to kind of drive much of our imagination and understanding of you know, architecture and design and art, and how that could be all brought together into this format that we call a simulation. And I'm going to talk a little bit also about the new Campo Marzio, which Casey was mentioning, and it's really a fantastic project that I think we enjoyed working on with Casey and Laura. This project was exhibited last year at Ars Electronica, and I mean, what is kind of interesting about New Campo Marzio from our point of view is that it is a kind of an open-ended 0-player simulation game. And as Casey was showing, it's powered by artificial intelligence. So in this case, there is no player, right? There is no one actually interacting with the world. It's all happening automatically. All the camera movements, all the these kind of agent movements, everything is kind of happening within this open-endedness of the simulation. And the work is based on Piranesi's kind of very important Campo Marzio plan map from 1762. And this drawing that Piranesi made kind of holds a special place in architectural imagination. It was a topic of numerous debates and of the nature of the city. And Casey mentioned some of these contemporary debates, but also the drawing has a long history of different people trying to understand what it is about, because Piranesi presented the drawing really as a found condition of Rome. And then everyone immediately saw and they thought like, oh, but this is impossible, that this is actually a speculative design project, right? So it's a topic of numerous debates, but also we were kind of guided, I think, in this exploration by the work of Peter Trumer and his reading of the Piranesi drawing and kind of projects that came out of it at that time. So there is a number of kind of speculative projects by Peter Eisenman and by Jeffrey Kipnis and other people that were trying to understand how to kind of speculate on that drawing in a more contemporary sense, right? In the original drawing, the city can be understood as kind of an endless space of these in-between conditions, which is a city without streets, without infrastructure, made only of architecture, which is kind of the historical maybe origin of the figure diagram, as they say in the formal kind of architectural circles. There is no distinction between architecture and the urban field. Everything becomes kind of a potential of organization. And, you know, if you zoom into the drawing, as Casey was also showing you, you can see that it's a constellation of points, endless small kind of points that are architectural elements. And I think this was kind of the basis of thinking about it in a way, like this idea of constellation of dense cloud, right, of points. Like, what if a city could be a dense cloud of points that is then generated in the background by a machine learning system that is trained on Piranesi variations, right, on his own work. And then what happens if we kind of extend this project into other territories? Like in this case, we were looking at particularly this idea of the entourage and of kind of architectural characters, or we could say basically kind of these figures and players, these kind of soft robots or whatever you want to call them, right? And this is also kind of also inspired by the work of John Hayduck and his kind of treatment of in his later work, this idea that architecture can become a character, that architectural objects can be also kind of characters, right? And I think what is happening is we have a kind of a host of these characters or entourage of these characters in the project. So this was, I think, also massively inspired by Jeffrey Kipnis's version of Campo Marzio, where the project becomes kind of a fictional tableau filled with roster of these figures of different types that can feel the space and start communicating with the space in a different way. So the work by Piranesi is primarily a drawing, right? I mean, this is kind of the format of that work, and it belongs also to the history of analytical drawings that have informed architecture for centuries. So we have kind of speculated that the simulation could bring new layers of reading into this history. In this case, we are the simulation is running on a kind of on the back of a neural network that is learning features of the original drawing and then kind of generates these 3D versions in real time. And it really, I think, becomes a kind of a supercharged drawing for the production of worlds. I think to me, this was the main outcome of the project, to see that this kind of new format of representation that we are using can kind of maybe reinvent not only the subject matter of such a illustrious historical drawing, right, but also the format itself, right, which is something that we are really interested in, the history of drawings and how what we are doing is basically kind of an extension of that history of drawings, right? So the worlds that we make, they kind of serve as hosts for autonomous agents that become the new inhabitants of Campo Marzio. And now I am gonna ask Lidija to kind of explain a little bit about these characters that we are looking at.
Hi. In the new Campo Marzio project, I work on designing characters and their behaviors. We started with the idea that the agents will resemble some sort of autonomous robotic sculpture. My idea here was to rethink the way that AI, robots, and technology is usually represented. Instead of working with highly mechanical aesthetics, I was interested in establishing another more humanistic and poetic view of technology. One of the main sources of inspiration was the way Hayao Miyazaki treats technology in his films. The characters roam the environment, sensing and discovering every new generation of the city. I wanted to infuse them with a curious and unpredictable personality. Through joyful and expressive movement, they are performing choreography within the space. Some of them are jumping, rolling, and flipping around. They are communicating through hugging, nodding, and stretching. What if this was a new language of how AI communicates? Now I will tell you something about Dream Estate project. Dream Estate is a self-driven simulation set within a synthetic landscape populated with procedurally generated androids. In this project, we were interested in exploring the possibilities of procedural design for artificial humanoid agents. There are many aspects to be considered when designing an artificial being. For example, how it looks, complexity and shape of the body, its movements and personality. The most complex but least visible layer is the personality. Personality can be invoked through the design of the movement or by exaggerating some physical traits. But if you want to have a believable character that could behave within the simulation, then it needs to have its own persona. That can be achieved by not only designing their physical body, but their behavior as well. What is really interesting when you think about an artificial character is that it doesn't have any inherited social constraints. It is pure, empty. They're like empty vessels that you can use to project your desires, expectations, and emotions. This reminded me of playing with toys when we were children and how they were alive to us in our imagination. They had their own narratives and adventures. For the viewer, person engaging in the simulation, we wanted to evoke those memories of playing with toys. To develop the agents, we were interested first in their emotional states and environmental influences. We started with a series of emotional responses from Plachek's model. And then we paired that with our existing brain, soul, body model to produce different behaviors. The behavior tree works like a brain, and here we are creating models for behavior that is further transferred to AI NPC player that is controlling the body of the character. Each android has knowledge about one emotion. By wandering the world and interacting, they will tell each other their story about emotions. We started using GPT-2 to make the narrative for the androids to share between each other. For each emotion, we were sampling collections of work from famous philosophers and writers. The androids also developed a relationship within their environment through the environmental query system that is mapping and evaluating spatial details like obstacles, measuring distance, visibility, and direction. Behavioral model is based on 8 emotions that can be triggered by the stimulus. Each character starts with one primary emotion and then keeps evolving through the narrative. If, for example, fear is triggered by a stimulus, brain will recognize that as a danger and it will start protective behavior. If joy is triggered, the brain will read that as a connection and then it will start a bonding behavior, and so on. Here you can see some images of different characters in their habitat. And for each character, I have developed custom procedural tools in Houdini that can produce endless versions of their appearance. And now Damjan will tell you something about Planet City Simulator.
Yeah. So I wanted to show you after just a few work in progress projects that we are kind of developing right now. And this one is called the Planet City Simulator. We're also working with Ream. And this is part of SciArc's kind of proposal for the Getty Foundation Pacific Standard Time art exhibition that will happen in, I think, 3 years from now. And so the game that we are developing is based on the idea by an environmental scientist called Edward O. Wilson. And he has this idea called the half Earth. And basically, in his idea, in order to kind of save the planet and the ecosystem from the global warming and climate change, the entire human society has to be compressed into one massive city, and then half of the planet has to be left for rewilding and kind of figuring out by itself how to heal itself, basically, right? And we were interested in how can we model the scenario where the entire human population occupies a single massive city and the rest is left to plants and animals, right? This is a kind of an interesting idea because just of the scope and the scale of that kind of project. So the simulator that we are making is both a kind of an interactive model of complex urban conditions, but also it's a new narrative structure for architectural world making. And the system that we are trying to grasp is something, is close to what Timothy Morton would call a hyperobject. It's an object that is so massively distributed in time and space that they kind of transcend the specificity, or they you cannot represent them legibly somehow through the more standard ways that for example urban projects are presented, right, through this idea of maps and diagrams and kind of descriptions of space and zoning ideas. So this is where the kind of the simulation can come into play. We are interested to kind of see how we can legibly model that city through the simulation, right? And for all scales of the city, we are also using machine learning techniques for organizing and extracting data and driving the generative process of the city itself. This is a work in progress, and we are still very much gathering all the information and trying to understand how can we approach this model, right? And I think by the time we are finished, we will also publish it as a standalone video game, which is something that we are always discussing as Casey and I are always discussing this as a maybe new way that architecture can enter into public consciousness, right? If maybe architecture can become interesting for the general population again, and it becomes part of the conversation about the world. And I also want to show you just this, which is what we're now starting in the studio. This we are looking into this idea of the Nova scene, and we are making this massive multiscalar urban simulation right now. And the work that the Nova scene is based on is this new book by James Lovelock, who was the kind of the author of the Gaia theory, which was very, very popular in the 80s. And his new work is where he postulates that AI is the next stage of the evolution of the planetary ecosystem. And in his view, kind of information is the fundamental property of the universe, and AI will emerge from the womb of Anthropocene into a new era that he calls the Novacene. And what we are making is kind of the project, a speculative simulation on the possible city of intelligent self-replicating AIs. And here, basically, we are not looking at AI as humanoid figures, but basically AI as a parallel ecosystem that ranges from microorganisms to kind of city block scale entities. And the question is like, what would it be like to live in a megastructure, for example, that is entirely made from intelligent agents that can shift and change the space and reorganize and basically it's a future where the organic and the inorganic life starts to collaborate. And we love this poem from the 60s called All Watched Over by the Machines of Loving Grace, which is kind of the more positive take on technology and how technology can merge with the organic, and how there is a path forward for a more positive and a non-dystopian idea of kind of coexistence between different species of intelligence. And here are some just very early work in progress drawings of different scales of this. And yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Damjan and Lydia. That was amazing. I was kind of thinking of I mean, putting all these together. It's been a fantastic presentation, series of presentations. And I was thinking about starting off with the Refik's kind of comment that he was trying to bring Frank Gehry's building alive through his projections, and I think succeeded very well. But it struck me that really what you guys have been doing as a whole has been keeping the discourse alive, keeping architecture alive by bringing that creativity and creating a new way of thinking in architecture. I'm totally convinced that that AI is going to make that happen anyway. But it's wonderful to see such incredible creativity coming from all you guys. We've got now some time for some questions. There are a lot of questions in the chat here. I just wanted to maybe give an opportunity to what. First of all, I would like to welcome Wan Yuhe. Wan Yuhe has been, of course, a really important figure within introducing AI in the world of China, especially with Xcool, and also to invite Philip as well to come up with some questions. I've got a lot of questions myself, but maybe I'd Wan Yuhe and Philip.
Yeah, maybe Philip, Professor Yuan, you can be the first, or shall I?
You go ahead, Wan Yuhe.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay. Fantastic shares, presentations. Seriously, I got a lot of inspirations from all the presentations. I never imagined AI can do simulation and turn into games. That is really fascinating, seriously. I saw a lot of works using GAN and generate the images and even videos to show new possibilities. I think that is the part we are searching for, creativities. What we are doing as Xcool, we are not just using GAN, but we are merging a lot of new models like GAN, CNN, and reinforcement learning. All those things is the tools or technologies help us to get to the most important question: what we aiming to? Yeah, I saw there's a audience also send a question in the Bilibili channel, and he's also asking that. Yeah, I think it's a very important. We need to understand what is our goal, and to answer this question, we need to find out what is the rules or what is the box. Because when we're talking about creativity, we always say we jump out of the box. The box is something we knew before and something we're familiar with, and out of the box is something we are not familiar with. And that is the part AI could help us to search into. And so I think it's the most important question is to understand, I think the most important question is to understand and also to shape the question, to shape the box. As a Xcool, we are practicing with those models to find the right questions or find the right rules to set up for massive production architectural design. And for that part, the question or the rules can be determined clearly. And for some of those issues, such as design a museum, for instance, it can be really open. There's several or thousands, millions of different answers to different parameters of questions. So I'm really glad to see there's a different explorations, which are really, inspiring. Because such as refill, I think. Sorry, sorry, I need to Refik, right? Refik. Yeah, it's the first the work. Yeah. Sorry, is my signal okay? Yeah, his first work he's showing is really interesting, and also the media work he's showing in Australia Museum, that one is also inspiring. And
thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for that one. Yeah, and I think it's also right path to go through. As actually, I'm a student of Peter Trumer, back to Berlin Institute, so I totally agree with Casey. Yeah, when you're talking about this part, I think that is something we are also chasing for, that we are trying to find the rules out of the randomness. And the randomness is something not just the AI, but the machine is really capable with. And yeah, and the work of Daniel and Lidija, and I think it's really, really interesting, the game and the simulation. I think the most important issue is, yeah, I think the most important issue of simulation is it's a very limited. I think you need to set up the rules, right? And the rules depends on the computational power. It can just be limited, but you guys are brought up to really enormous factors, and it can in fact influence each other and shows really fabulous work. I mean, that is really interesting. Because for us, for X School, we are more practical in the practice. For instance, we also use simulation for commercial mall design. How we use it is we setting up a different intelligence agencies with different characteristics. For instance, some of those are the 20 to 25 years old young lady, and some are like 35 to 40-year-old men and kids, etc. And we throw them into the mall, and it can simulate the condition, and we can learn how this space could work. So this is some of the example we are using. And also for the Xcode AI design, we are using like GAN and different models to generate. We are using the generations to generate the designs. For instance, for a residential area design, we input some of the parameters and the machine can design for us. But those designs are based on the box we set up. And this box is not something we came up with, but it's something we really learned from the cases and experience. Let's be specific about the cases. It's more than 10 million different like studies, let's say. And also that's the data part. And also experience, we mean like reinforcement learning. Machine can learn from each other's practice, and by interaction with the architects, we will know which one is good, which one's bad, and in terms of different parameters. So with those kind of technologies, we can really have the machine help us to find something we are looking for. I think all the efforts we are trying all here is really meaningful. We are really trying to find out the creativities that our machine could help us to deal with. Because I remember Casey also said when machine just doing random GAN simulation, random GAN, this generative adversarial neural networks, and those things are all very similar, as this building does not exist, we showed before. And that one, Neil helped us to show it before, yeah. That one is very similar because it's learned from the history, learned from the existence. But with the reinforcement learning, with the implement of the human activity or interactions, machine can generate itself. And that is the way I think it can explore further, not just the do the mimic of what we have before, but also do something we didn't have. That's just like AlphaGo Zero. It doesn't learn from any of the Go game history strategies, but it just learned the basic rules of black and white Go chess. And then they can play with itself and know which ones win. And by a lot of reinforcement learning, there's a different ones. and then it can find out really a lot of different strategies that human beings has never seen before. I think that is the meaning of creativity. Find out something, it is already there, but we haven't yet discovered or we haven't yet revealed before. So yeah, thank you all. It's a really fabulous presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Neil, for organizing this, and Philip, thank you.
Oh, thank you for coming along. I mean, there was a lot of questions there, and it was maybe if you'd like to respond, I know Refik, you want to say something there? We've seen something. I'll just say just briefly. Patrick Schumacher has also explored the possibility of agents of simulating behaviors in buildings. I mean, Daniel Bolojan is doing some doctoral research with Patrick Schumacher on this thing, and it's feeding into the work of the office. Refik, please.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with Wanyu. I think what she says is definitely the next step of like pretty much deep minds. I think trajectory exploring the agents and their policies and many other intelligent mechanisms to invent is very important. But I think one topic is also very inspiring for me is like the consciousness. I don't think there's any chance to like talk about any creativity without understanding consciousness. Quantifying this phenomenon is still a big challenge, right? I mean, there is pretty much incredible research like Anil's and many others that are like trying to quantify what does really creativity means and how it comes and where it emerges and how that like plays a role in cognitive capacity of humanity. And I think what is so exciting is that the more the AI or any similar imagination tools becoming more available for artists, at least from my perspective, the more we have a chance to talk about the thinking brush concept. The other idea, I think what is really inspiring is, for me at least, this time as a material is very important in the arts, as we all know, because time is a very unique problem of understanding physics as well, not only just space. So I believe the latent space of machine intelligence will be a beautiful chaos for humanity while understanding who we are. And I think it's a kind of a mirror model. It's just not so new, actually, right? We always try to understand who we are through these kind of technologies. But I think what I found, at least in my research, the fresh dialogue is between the quantum engineers at Google AI. I mean, no offense to other AI research, but I never thought about physics and nature as deep as possible in any research I did personally. I mean, for 7 months with one of the most brilliant minds, I spent so deep discussions about many theories that couldn't even be, like even the Einstein had this spooky keyword that he has a challenge to understand this concept. And over the years, even it still couldn't find its perfect reason. To be honest, I think AI itself will be limited to understand, who we are and nature. And it's eventually quantum mechanics needs to be in the game to understand really what's going on here in reality. So my personal take is, at least from my humble quantum memories, at least for my last 6-7 months, was a truly inspiring, much larger leap in my mind, in my imagination, than just working with neural networks. And I think the simulation concept is extremely very meaningful, as Damjan and Lidija also like share. And there is no single way of exploring anything in future without simulation. I don't think so. Simulation is a must to understand, to perceive, to speculate, to just deep dive. And every single idea is a simulation eventually, right? Fundamentally. Also, lastly, it's a very Philip K. Dick Remembrance Day, but I think, as he said, the simulation doesn't go away when you stop believing it. So it's a similar idea of quantum mechanics, or many worlds interpretation, or so on. So my take is, on top of one use, of course, reinforcement learning and other policies that are applying to reward systems is a must. But if we can perceive and understand what's consciousness, then we can talk about sentient machines, and potentials of machines can become one day have a decision, power. And until that, I think we are gamification of all these ideas to find the big questions, I guess.
I don't know whether Damjan and Lidija would like to respond to that, or Casey.
I totally agree with what Refik said. I think the simulation, is becoming increasingly not only the format for culture, right, but it's also becoming the way of thinking about the world. And to me, the question of kind of machine intelligence and creativity starts and maybe ends with the questions that art history was always asking, for example, right? Where does the new come from? Like where you know, what is the site of the new? Like in modernity, they understood actually that the new comes from not only the social political conditions of the world, but it also comes from the kind of the technological condition, right? That the tools that you're using and the kind of the idea of what technology is available to you to think about the world. So to me, these questions are so interesting when also Refik talks about quantum, right? It's not only a new tool, but it's a new way of thinking about the world that the tool will kind of bring into the debate, right? In the same way that we can talk about like machine hallucinations or you know, because AI has trained us to kind of think about it in that way. I think what is coming next probably with these tools is something very similar. But one thing that I found in some of the research we were doing is that maybe for understanding the world, we might need to kind of establish new ways of thinking that are not based on kind of classical stepwise logic, like linear kind of logic that computation was established upon, right? And maybe that's where I think AI is, to me, the most meaningful as a way of rethinking our modes of thinking, actually, right? And how, if we can learn something from AI, I think it would be a way to embrace other modalities of understanding just. Yeah, this is how I feel about it. I don't know, or maybe Casey wants to, or we want to share some other ideas.
Lidija, you got thoughts?
I have. So what's really like inspiring and what's kind of weird to me is that notion that actually we have built those machines. We kind of built AI and we gave the inputs into those machines. But then what will happen when like machine starts to think and when machine wants to design itself? And this moment when we have to start to think how to approach differently to this idea and what could be that entity and how it would behave and how it will look, and yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I kind of maybe am in line with Damjan that for me, like these tools are ultimately these kind of mechanisms for perception. And it's why, like, you know, for example, I didn't show the architectural beast as, in a lot of ways, it's just like another one of these kind of projects, which is just, you know, endlessly generating some images. And I think more of the work we're doing is looking at using the networks to kind of build new value systems on data, or new value systems on the world. And it's like, as Damjan is saying, and I kind of inelegantly was trying to talk about in a lot of the kind of GoFe-based work, like we were trying to like code in step, like how a machine needs to behave to like detail a structural connection in relationship to a floor plate. And to a certain extent, we can do some of these things, but you know, the framework that the neural network is using as kind of one example of intelligent agency is this kind of hyperdimensional assemblage, right? A probabilistical space, which means that you can start to look at problems at multiple scales simultaneously without having to rely on this kind of linear path through. And in that sense, it becomes this really valuable camera, or like a mental camera, or like mental perceptual mechanism for approaching problems. I mean, even with the beast though, like, because I'm like so allergic to GANs, or like I'm so allergic to the GANs which take random vectors and turn them into something, not because there's anything wrong with them. I just have my own, I have a lot of rules that don't make sense for beyond my own office for myself. But even within the beast, the design of the beast, besides it just kind of endlessly generating images every day and posting to Instagram, was the main thing for me was designing how the beast searched the internet every night and retrained itself, and like was able to begin to, because I was interested in using the beast as a perceptual mechanism to try to look for the differences in the kind of features between what an institution or an academy might think of as architectural aesthetics or artistic aesthetics versus what the kind of collective evaluation is. Its own kind of space. It's emerged, but has its own kind of biases and collections on social media. So in a lot of ways, the beast itself, even though it was a kind of GAN-based project at one level, was really, for me, a way of like indexing these kind of aesthetics and like using the machine to understand these aesthetic relationships at different scales between these two different kind of bodies of culture, maybe.
Maybe Philip, we could bring you in here if you have a question. I know this is very much a different world to your material world, but nonetheless, I think it's super interesting. Philip, you're muted.
Yeah, it's quite amazing to all the speakers. I think it's great to expanding the boundary of the discipline. Especially, I think you mentioned about some very important factors, which is the implementation of the artificial intelligence. But most of them maybe not the high artificial intelligence, but maybe just a start to make use of different machine learning and different kind of ways in the visualization process or in the presentation process. I find it's quite interesting to mention, Casey mentioned the Campo Mazu. I think because that's the scale of city matters, and also the materialization matters, the AI creative process. I think that is still this kind of translation of from the formation simulation to the materialization is a kind of interesting part. I'm very interested is kind of pixelization of this kind of definition of the scale and how to present this kind of generative process to a material world. I think the question goes to very interesting because the discipline is there and also the gravity is there. The architecture still need to be there. We need to define the new, this kind of virtual world that is actually the new no boundary is kind of a new experience could be simulated in the virtual reality. But at the same time, I think it's kind of a definition Refik mentioned about the timing process. I think timing process is a kind of new dimension. We can redefining the materialization world, the material world. And that is a very interesting dimension we're adding to the reality. So the reality is not just a problem-solving process. It's kind of creative background, or it's kind of a very interesting boundary which can give a totally new definition, new creative process in the future. So I think here, maybe artificial intelligence name here is kind of a tool-based or computational algorithm-based. Still, I think real smart things can compete with the consciousness of human being. But I think the most in the future actually should be not just make use artificial intelligence as a kind of representation tools. It's kind of how can compete with the consciousness of human being and how to create some new possibility, which could be not just present in mind, but also could be also have a strong connection to the history, to the context of the city, to the materialization of the world. I quite appreciate Benjamin Bratton's name is a terraforming the planet. I think the planet should be reshaping by this kind of cyber and this kind of computational new definition by the quantum, which is coming in the near future. What I'm doing right now is, I think, have some relation to Casey mentioned. Actually, I'm quite interested in this kind of formation process, simulation process to the making of materialization process. I think the robotics can understand this kind of agent-based or kind of formation-based process and can directly translate this kind of definition to a making future. So that is why we make research in the robotics. Maybe right now it's low intelligence, but I think I believe in the future, this kind of connection can help us to redefining the the digital future in architecture, not only in the physical way, but also in the virtual way. So I'm quite appreciative. It's kind of a learning process to me. And I hope all the audience here, a lot of my students actually, they should learn a lot from all you guys. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, any particular response to that, or thank you, Philip. That's great. I mean, I do think that, you know, what we've been doing. I mean, Philip mentioned the word future, and I think the word future is absolutely central to what's been going on. Ahmed has made a comment on the chat that the future is here, and I think that's what we felt in some senses with Digital Future this summer. Is all the things we've been pushing, and suddenly it was here. We had to work online, we had to pay through contactless payment, and so on and so on. We had to use Zoom. And that's what we were trying to exploit. But I think in also the future is not just about the platforms, but also the ways of thinking that need to come in to kind of infiltrate architecture and really keep it alive. So in some ways, my take on the architectural beast was not necessarily the technology so much as the way it was kind of metaphor for how architecture was always feeding off other disciplines and feeding off other technologies. It seems to be like a shark. It has to sort of continually move forward, and architecture is certainly being brought alive by some of these ideas. Damjan, do you want to say anything or on top of all what Philip said, or Refik or Casey?
Just in terms of the material work, you know, like I think this is where I think we're spending most of our time in the office. Although I'm not showing what we're working on right now because I showed it to Gilles Retson last weekend, and he this is the first time I saw him just get visibly sad at how boring the things I was doing were. Like I work on a lot of boring stuff, but this was so epically boring. But this kind of issue of like kind of translating the kind of material into a kind of intelligence process. I think a project that I really like, and I think it's kind of early in its development, is like Lu Dan's work up at Tsinghua, where she's using the kind of machine learning to kind of learn material behavior in response to gestural inputs. And I really like how she's kind of positioning the artificial intelligence as a way of like reinterpreting the kind of modes of design production into the material. I mean, it's like one of those things where it's like right now the robot makes little squiggles of plastic, like you make a hand gesture and it does a little squiggle of plastic, but it's this idea about kind of these alternative forms of communication and like kind of distribution of value between like, you know, the material value versus the intuitive kind of tracking of the behavior of the human in response to production. I think a lot of the stuff that we do is much more about like, you know, correlating stress to timber fiber direction, things like that, which for me are more about kind of sitting in the automation practice and less a kind of trajectory towards a cultural or design innovation relationship to architectural production. But I think things like Lu, even if it's kind of a small thing right now, that's sitting at that mediated place, using the neural networks and the machine learning to operate between those two kind of spaces in a liminal way is maybe a trajectory forward with that.
So maybe just a few comments coming in from the chat. Philip Beasley is following this and is very excited by all the work. And he kind of makes a comment here: are these operations that can open domain spaces, perhaps seeking kinship with nature's open systems? Is there an entropy, the value that might contribute? There's also a question here from Marina from in Argentina. Beautiful work. Perhaps my question could be general, although I am thinking of Refik's work. What new sensibilities do you think can be stimulated through simulation? How do you think these new sensibilities will activate new agencies of interaction with matter?
Yeah, so I think for one of the exciting processes, like I'm in 2016 when I really witnessed what is a latent space. And since then it's 5 years and I'm still fascinated by the potential of interactivity. One thing that I'm really inspired last year, 2019, we have a chance to track 500 people, our audience, with a Bluetooth system inside the Kraftwerk in Berlin. And we were pretty much, very much enjoy the idea of generating an interactive model live in the architectural space. So that was a really interesting fun because, I mean, every day you have different 500 plus people and where they look, where they stay, and how long they stay and which direction was a beautiful anonymous data that generated some certain ways of vectors for the latent space that every single day was different. And it was also generated a kind of an AI church speculation, which was really fun. But what was really interesting speculation, at least from my humble understanding right now for Venice Biennale architecture, we are almost there, is we also explored truly what does space mean, not only in latent space, but our mind. So at the moment, we are working with Human Connectome data, 7,000 people's, as far as I know, the largest open source data for human mind that ever recorded and shared publicly. We were very much inspired what happens if the latent space of a human mind, truly human mind, becomes like a coordinate system. So at the moment, we are speculating, at least in a very high level, what are the common patterns of fibers in the human mind when we see a space? What exactly happens in the human mind, not only just neuroscientifically, but also functioning and structure concept of human mind. So it's a really fresh research from my perspective, at least, to form finding, to like speculating a material, but also using 3D KUKA robot to 3D print in real time while AI deciding certain possibilities. So I'm currently exploring latent space, the real-time world of robotics, but also real-time human mind, which is a BCI, brain, human brain to machines kind of coordinate systems, and what will happen if a machine truly syncs with our thoughts in a real time instead of we are watching a machine decision. So what are the possibilities of synchronicity between a human mind and machine mind is a really interesting concept. And architecting, perceptions, I think, a very beautiful ways of, at least artistically talking, how to generate new ways of finding meaning in the mind of a machine is at least my humble exploration at the moment.
That's something that we're going to be talking more about tomorrow in the question about AI and consciousness. It's actually very interesting how the links have been coming out today again and again about how we think and how AI thinks. Lidija, I would like to hear more from you, because it's the first time that I've come across you talking about your work. I've got to say that my students, I shared Lifeform's AI.io with my students 2 days ago, and they were blown away by some of that work. So I'm particularly interested to hear, because I must say, I don't know if you studied in Belgrade, but I once gave a lecture at the School of Architecture in Belgrade, and it was a curious experience, to say the least, because there was a small room full of old men smoking cigarettes and drinking Slivovitz, and they were just talking about themselves, and they were talking about some architect 50 years ago. I'm sure it was a very good architect, but what astonishes me out of that kind of culture, you and Damjan have appeared and are just revitalizing architecture, not because of, but despite of your background in Serbia. So maybe, Lidija, I'd invite you to say something.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, it's a really interesting background. So I also have some experience with fashion design. So I had 2 fashion labels, Fish and Toad and Green Legs. And I was working on that for a couple of years. And then I also had some experience with real architecture, like 8 years. And then I was always trying the way to combine and like mix those things. And I think with starting working with simulations and exploring personalities and characters, that was kind of the trajectory actually I was seeking, because when you're making architecture, you're always thinking about character and from whom you're actually making this space. Either it's a small house or a collective apartments. So it's always somehow you need to have someone to relate to. So I think like the things that we are doing right now, I kind of also browsing this area. And I'm also working with procedural tools that are like allowing me to make like not one unique copy, which what is like artists are usually doing. Like when you're making something, it's also usually unique thing. But with procedural tools, you're able to make infinite versions of that one unique thing. And then you have completely new approach how to think about something that is unique, because it brings different qualities that you can observe, and then like you can also give other people opportunity to have their own unique piece.
And I would say, like, from my point of view, actually, Belgrade is part of my history, but actually I was also in Frankfurt at the Städelschule for like 6 years. Städelschule is one of the kind of Europe's small but very famous kind of art academies. Actually, it's a small place, but very well known. And I studied there, and then I kind of worked there for 4 years with Johan Bettum, who was my professor, and Daniel Birnbaum, who is a very well-known figure in the art world. So this is like this mix between architecture and art, and I think the new technologies, that's where it's really kind of gained some legs. And I just wanted to comment on a few things that I think Philip was asking. This idea of, and many other questions that were in the chat were kind of implying maybe that we need to start translating from the simulation space into the real space somehow. And, there is this kind of difference between, and this is, I would just put forward that this is precisely, I think, what we need to maybe rethink this question, because that kind of thinking comes out of the history or of the tradition of like mind-body dualism, like the Cartesian idea that somehow there is a difference between what we think in our headspace and we are the passive observers of the world, and the world is actually where the reality is situated. And in architecture, this is kind of then becomes this question of like, oh, you're working with projects, but then you need to actually have the real somehow thing. And in many other like examples, if you look at Alberti, for example, who is the father of architectural discipline, he never built anything but his ideas, right? And I think what we need is a rethinking of that mind-body dualism, and maybe that's where the extension between the virtual and the real and the so-called actual would be, I think in this possibility that we can construct of kind of integrating these things and speaking of them in an equal way, where we are not giving primacy to one or the other, because the more we discover about the human mind, the more we are actually amazed how vast that conversation becomes. And especially thinking about the quantum technology and the possibility of that kind of approach to hold ambiguous information, right? Things that are not supposed to come together in the same idea, which I think is really fascinating. So I would just, that's how I would like to think about it, as a spectrum. And especially, there is a history of thinking about virtual as kind of the other pole of the spectrum, the so-called real virtual continuum, and this is how I think we can operate today. And I think also in Refik's work and Casey's work, to me that is very visible, right? This idea of collapsing all modalities of reality into one kind of continuous kind of expression, So this is, to me, this is really the core of creativity somehow today. This idea that you can operate in different spaces with the sense of wonder, but also some expertise and some kind of bold proposals, And so that's why I think it's kind of it's a great discussion today to also talk about that.
No, I completely agree. I think you must have read Slavoj Žižek's writing on virtual reality, where he basically said, what virtual reality shows us is not how virtual reality is, but rather how virtual reality itself is. I just wanted to comment just quickly on the question about Alberti, because I don't know if you know, but I translated Alberti years ago from Latin into English, so I'm very familiar with the world, as I say, Campo Macho. But one thing that that was challenged in the summer when we had a discussion with Sanford Quinta, I was describing how Alberti kind of spoke about how architects devised in the mind and realized through construction. And he challenged me on that. He said, no, I don't know any architect who devises in the mind. They do it through interacting with, pencil on paper or on the computer screen, in a way. And that then opens up this possibility of seeing these new tools as precisely, what can you do with them? I think, it's a question of the affordances of these new tools. What do they allow you to do? And what I find so astonishing about all the work we've seen today is that you have really opened up a new form of creativity through using the tool. The tool has opened up things and you're exploring what you can do with it. And absolutely not, it's just about imitating the past. It's about opening up new horizons. That's certainly my view. And I think that, I think that this is what I see happening now, is this incredible burst of creativity happening in architecture through this new tool. I just wanted to kind of maybe, while we got Wanyu and Philip here, there's something really special happening in China. I mean, China seems to really be embracing AI in many different sort of ways. And maybe I just wanted, maybe you could offer some kind of reflection about why AI is so important in China right now.
I think I want to go back to Damjan's comments. I think the world is there not only physical, but also virtual right now. So the new technology actually is a new experimental process for expanding the new possibilities, especially the mindscape could be designed by the tools, and it could be representing by the new tools, and could be seen by the new platform or new tools. So it's kind of expanding of the boundary of architecture, what we name here, what is architecture. But at the same time, the physical world is still there. And I think a lot of algorithms actually have been developed very early, but the implementation of them is very interesting. I want to put the example in China, for example, the COVID-19 situation after it's coming, the government actually implement this kind of AI to give very smart management or very precise management of the community or the gated community-based group of people, how to manage their healthy data or information, helps to very precisely manage situation of people during this kind of scenarios. So I think that is AI-based scenarios, which is engaged into the social management. So this is the problem. Where is the problem? Where is the tools? So although the tools is very developed, on the one hand, at the very beginning, it could be like a paradigm-based, or could be like artistic-based, or could be like a very abstract machine to generate idea. But afterwards, the most importantly is how you put this kind of new tools in the scenarios of reality. So the reality and the dreams both there. So I think the discipline of design actually is not an inventor of the tools, but it's kind of a smart, intelligent, or it's kind of new consciousness or potential consciousness the designers can give the possibility of new tools. So it's a kind of connection from the abstract machine to the solid machine to the physical machine. I think we should balance both of them. I appreciate what your simulators you mentioned, this kind of very abstract imagination of new boundary of the endless spatial world. I think it's kind of a new creative possibility. You can help the designers to expanding their imagination based on different kind of tools. But at the same time, I think how to put this kind of tools in the scenarios of daily life, or how to translate this kind of machine to the mind architecture and the physical architecture. I think that's a challenge to all of us. Yeah, thank you. Maybe one of you have some comments on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Philip. I just want to refer to Neil's question from a different point of view, not from architects, but from the point of a tech company or the investors. I think the most important issue in China today is the aging issue. Like today, I have a data, very new data. That's the newborn of the Chinese babies last year was just 10 million. That is in history the lowest. And we have people like aging every day. So the issue brought out that we don't have that much of a working population anymore compared to 10 years, 20 years ago. That at that moment, those laborers are the most benefits or the big benefits of the Chinese society. But today it became the issue because we don't have that much people working maybe in 10 years or 15 years. For instance, for the construction site, we did a investment of about that investigation on the construction site. Today, the average age of the workers on site is about 45 to 50 years old, which means after like 10 years, they won't work there anymore. And the woman percentage on construction site today is much higher than 10 years ago. And today there's no young people on the site. The young people's percentage is under 20%. Where are they? They are all delivering food, delivering goods, and that's what they are working with. Like also they are like driving the Uber cars in China called Didi cars. So there's no young people doing this very basic or fundamental work anymore. So we need something to support that. For instance, why autopilot in China is so popular? It's so popular. It's hot. Why? Because we don't have that much population doing this kind of service anymore. Yes, today there's some, but in the future we might don't have. Also for the factories, for the laborers, yeah, it's a big issue. I think that's the fundamental question, why China is so into AI, because we need the people, but we don't have that much people. So we need the artificial intelligence to help us to go through this issue, because we're still undergoing. I mean, this country is still under development. For instance, our urbanization is just 60.5%. Yeah, that's the data from yesterday, from last year. But at the same time, like Europe or States is above 80%. So we still have a long way to go, but we don't have that much people anymore. We don't want to become like Japan or other Asian society. So artificial intelligence, that is the way to resolve this issue. I have a lot of friends doing AI tech companies. For instance, they are using AI in mechanical detections. For instance, like the MIR scanning. It can help the young doctors to diagnose what is the symptoms very quickly. And we don't need that much doctor anymore in this case. And also there's some other doing AI combining with the ERP that helps the factories to go through the manufacturing procedures, and also doing some robotics to help the very easy jobs on site as well. So I think that is the potential of AI, help us in the future. Yeah, that is something I think also for architects, for architectural fields, we are also facing, because we are also out of young architects. I don't know if you feel that way, but I know there's a lot of young architects came to our company saying, I don't want to do design anymore. I don't want to work overnight anymore. I don't want to be architect. I want to do something cross-disciplinary. Cross-disciplinary. Yeah, that is something I saw today, that we are losing talents from our fields because the workload in the real world is so heavy. I was working in OMA, I know that. And also some Chinese design institutes, they really work like day and night and chasing by this real estate developments or the urban developments. So we need to find something to help them. That is also the reason why I'm doing X-School, because I'm thinking, and X-School, we are thinking to help architects to go through this. Yeah.
Maybe I could just, one thing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lenny. Just one final kind of comment. We should wrap up soon, but tomorrow, of course, we've got Memo Actum coming on board. I want to ask Refik, there's something happening in Turkey. I don't know what it is. Last week, we had the most incredible presentation by some young Turkish interactive designer, and, Gülbenç also and things. Why in Turkey are we seeing this kind of extraordinary AI-based exploration? Is it something cultural or what's happening?
I mean, it's a very good question. I think sometimes when the limitations are there, and if you believe in learning to learn, I think the culture can evolve much faster than a traditional academic discourse. And I think it's one of the reasons I believe that in Turkish culture, there's some certain limitations of education. But the society just evolved from, learning through internet. And when you just go beyond the academic speed, when you go like beyond just, traditional ways of research, when you just feel that the limitations are not on anymore in financial, but your time and efforts, the culture evolves much quicker. And I think that's exactly what happened. Academia was slower, but the people were like anxious to go beyond what they can do. And eventually they touch, and of course, the world is so open to new ideas at the moment. And I think this happened at least for me, 11 years ago, literally, I was on the street with my short in Istiklal Street, one of the most unique places, with Alper Derimboğaz, another UCLA AUD colleague. And I met with Greg Lin on the street of Istanbul when he was watching my first piece on an architectural space. And I didn't know what am I doing really. But I read his piece Animate Form back in time, and I made a piece as a reaction. And when I see him on the street in Istanbul 2011, and he just said, do you know UCLA AUD? And that's how I know that was even happening 11 years ago. It just naturally grew, and that happened to many people. So sometimes constraints are good. I think sometimes lack of resources are good. I think that allows us to go beyond our comfort zone, and that I think helps us to go beyond what we can do.
Okay, maybe what we could. I just want to just briefly mention a couple of things. First of all, I mentioned. It seems like we've almost segued into tomorrow's discussion already. But I wanted to say that not only are we going to privileged to have Refik again there tomorrow, but also Memo Acton, whose work I think is absolutely fabulous. Anil Seth, I will just mention. Just have a look at his TED talk about perception as a form of controlled hallucination. And you can see the links that have been established between the machine hallucinations of what's being produced by Refik and the team today, and also the kind of way that Anil Seth's talking about it. I think this is going to be an incredible discussion, and I welcome everyone to come and join us. I just want to also mention that the following week we have a team from Russia coming in. And talking about this radical new avant-garde that is emerging there. Just what I want to say, Russia is, because we have some Eastern European or Central Eastern Europeans here today, Russia was something. When I was a student, I was fortunate at the University of Cambridge. We had Catherine Cook telling us about Russian constructivism and Russian suprematism and so on. And it was a moment, I think, when also Rehm Koolhaas and Zaha were looking to Russia to go and see some of these new ideas that were coming in. And to my mind, it was such a crucial intervention when Rehm and Zaha came in and started sort of radically revitalizing architecture, because up until then we had this crisis moment. I was a student during postmodernism, which to my mind was the kind of the death of architecture in many ways. And the comment that Derrida made at the time when he got involved is that what this this burst of formal activity that was doing was revitalizing architecture and keeping architecture alive. And that is precisely, I think, what you guys have shown us today is how architecture can be alive, or art. I mean, I'm not quite sure what we call it now, because it seems to be a kind of spectrum of ideas that's kind of very much overlapping one another. But there's a radical new revitalization happening in architecture, I think, largely because of these tools. And I just want to thank everyone for this incredible inspiration today. It was really a remarkable set of presentations. I hope that everyone's going to be joining us every single week. On a Saturday, we're trying to keep this platform alive, and we want to make it, it's a platform for everyone. It doesn't matter where you come from. We want to turn this into some global classroom so everyone can benefit from these things. And in a way, I take heart from Refik's comment about what he wanted to do. And I saw it in his early kind of comments of making it public, making it available, and making it available for free. For that is what we're trying to do. Trying to make education shouldn't be a privilege of the rich. It should be available for everyone. And we try to use this platform to spread ideas across the world. So I just want to kind of finish up on that comment and to thank you so much for this. I know that it's incredibly early in LA, but this is really, you've kind of revitalized, I think, architecture between you. And I mean, I know Refik's outside, but I think we're almost in a kind of, we're almost all together now. And I just want to thank you for that. And I want to invite you tomorrow to come and listen to this incredible debate with Anil Seth, who was already engaged with Refik, and it was an incredible moment in the summer when I brought those people together. I also want to bring Memo into the frame of reference tomorrow. So it's going to be, I think, a fantastic event. So thank you, everyone, and see you next Saturday, and see some of you tomorrow if you can make it. This was tremendous. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.